All right, welcome everyone to another Thursday evening. My name is Ewan McGaughey, and this is our fifth lecture in the series on Labour's current economic policy. Today we're covering energy and transport, and I might as well start off with the big orange elephant in the room, which is that I'm sure we're not all entirely delighted with the result of the Tuesday election in America, and Trump will indeed return to the White House without an insurrection this time in January next year. So this is relevant for our topic today because, of course, the last time that Trump got into power, one of the first things that he did was to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And I don't know if anybody in the room is American, but a lot of my friends who are in despair, are asking why on earth has this happened, how could this possibly be? What I want to try and do perhaps over the course of this lecture is give you a little bit of hope, a little bit of solace that maybe it's not entirely as bad as it seems. It's pretty awful for America, no question about it. But when we're looking at the big picture for the climate crisis, America is in fact 11% of global emissions now, so not entirely huge. It is declining as a percentage of the global economy. Of course, America's corporations are very influential and add on to that 11%. But the energy transition is certainly in full swing. And from our perspective in the UK, of course, we're minuscule now, 0.7% of global carbon emissions from the UK. But as we saw last week, we have an outsized influence, firstly because our corporations abroad contribute a huge amount to global greenhouse gas emissions. And secondly, as we covered last week, we have a multi-trillion financial sector based in the City of London, and the enormous amount of financial capability that the rules that we set for our city influences is also a really big part of the puzzle of solving the climate crisis. So it is possible that even despite the disaster of another Trump for the climate agenda, it is possible that there's a very big possibility that we play a positive role in the UK. And of course, that's what we're here for, to look at the pledges that the current government has and what could be done to meet them. So same as before, we're going to run through in the first half the background of where we stand. And then in the second half, we've got Matt Lawrence, who's the director and founder of a think tank called Commonwealth. Fabulous work coming out all the time from there, and has played a key role shaping the ideas that many of which are influential in the government. So he'll kick off the discussion part, and then, of course, we'll open it to everyone here to hear what you think. Okay, so we start with the pledges that Keir Starmer had when he was running for Labour leader. He said, put the Green New Deal, not the Green New Scam as Trump calls it, but the Green New Deal at the heart of everything that we do. There is no issue more important to our future than the climate emergency. He said he wanted a Clean Air Act to tackle pollution locally, demand international action on climate rights. Public services, he then said, should be in public hands, not making profits for shareholders. Support common ownership. Of course, that's something that's slightly different to nationalisation, but common ownership of rail, mail, energy and water. And of course, rail and energy are important for us today. Then in the manifesto, things become a little more nailed down. Labour's manifesto just before the election says, we want to make Britain a clean energy superpower to cut bills, create jobs, deliver security with cheaper zero carbon energy by 2030, so that's a big pledge, accelerating to net zero. We want to maintain strategic gas reserves to guarantee security of supply. And then as we covered the last 2 weeks, there's mandatory plans for the FTSE 100 and all of the city's financial institutions to align with the 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement. A bit more specific, there's a pledge for a new Energy Independence Act, which is supposed to establish the framework for Labour's energy and climate policies. Labour's going to create Great British Energy, the bill's already there, and it'll be owned by the British people and deliver power back to the British people, which sounds to me like generation and distribution, or a combination, and actually doing it. Labour will not, however, it says, revoke existing licences of oil and gas fields, and they're going to manage fields for the entirety of their lifespan, they say, and not grant new coal licenses and ban fracking for good. And finally, relating to transport, Labour says that it's supporting the transition to electric vehicles. We want to roll out charge points, give certainty to manufacturers by restoring the phase out of the internal combustion engine with a date of 2030. Put passengers at the heart of rail by bringing it into public ownership. New powers for local leaders to franchise local bus services and lift the existing ban outside London, I might just sort of make clear, on municipal ownership of bus services. Okay, so those are the pledges, and just to sort of recap and summarize and give this a bit of structure, we've got sort of three main things that we're going to concentrate on during the lecture. We've got the oil and gas industry, and so the pledge here is no new oil and gas. We want international action on climate rights. We're going to keep strategic gas reserves, and this is going to be sort of filtered somehow through an Energy Independence Act. Second sort of package of reforms, we've got this pledge in 2030 for zero carbon electricity, a public Great British Energy to deliver power. And the third sort of group of ideas is public ownership of rail, municipal buses, 2030 ban on the internal combustion engine, so that means electric cars, we're electrifying roads, and we've got this idea of the Clean Air Act. So through the rest of the lecture, we're going to go through, as always, the human rights that are engaged, the legal background in the UK, where we fit internationally, what the data tells us about how we're doing currently, look at reform models, and actually I've got benefits and costs there, but I've sort of merged that in with models for reform. So hopefully we manage to cover all of this swiftly. Okay, so you've already seen this before if you've come to the previous lectures, but it bears repeating. The key human right that we're talking about with everything related to energy and transport is that everyone under the Universal Declaration, the European Convention on Human Rights, the International Covenants on Civil and Political and Economic and Social Rights, everyone has the right to life. And this has been interpreted by the European Court of Human Rights in its jurisprudence, both on Article 2 of the Convention and Article 8, to mean that member states in Europe, signatories to the Council of Europe, everyone wants to do that, everyone does that rather, this places a positive duty, the right to life, on member states to reduce emissions in line with the United Nations framework on climate change. And the Court of Justice, the Court of Human Rights says, in a case called Klimasignorinen and Switzerland, elderly Swiss ladies who sued the Swiss government for not doing enough to take action to reduce emissions, the Court of Human Rights says the state's primary duty is to adopt and to effectively apply in practice regulations and measures capable of mitigating the existing and potentially irreversible future effects of climate change. So every country in Europe has to, as a matter of mandatory human rights law, decarbonize its economy to mitigate the existing and potentially irreversible effects of climate change through all possible means. It's a positive duty on the state. That means it encompasses what the state does and the state's control of private enterprise. But when we're looking at energy and transport, I think another human right, which is often forgotten, comes into play. It's right at the end of the Universal Declaration, and it says everyone has the right to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. And just to give you a tiny bit of background, because this one sort of doesn't sound quite the same as, you know, the right to life, the right against torture, the right to a fair trial. Why have we got a right to the benefits of science? The answer is that it came from the New Deal when two things were going on. FDR's government, Roosevelt's government, wanted to roll out a polio vaccine and found, well, you can't just sort of leave it to existing medical institutions. You need positive government action to make sure everyone gets their shots or polio drops. And the second thing was rural electrification. So the energy companies that connected people to the grid in the cities in America in the 1930s said, well, we can't possibly electrify rural Alabama and Louisiana. It just costs too much to get electricity to those people. And so they weren't doing it, and the government rolled out the Rural Electrification Act, which made sure that everybody did in fact get connected, and of course they did, and it wasn't nearly as expensive as everyone said, and that fed into this idea that the government has to take proactive action to make sure everyone shares in the benefits of science. So we can have technological advance, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the market makes sure that everyone gets them. We need positive government action. So when we're talking about solar power, the new technology in big wind turbines, battery storage, electric vehicles, this human right tells us that, well, the technology really needs to be rolled out by a positive government agenda. And as we've seen before, this matters because the climate crisis isn't stopping. This is carbon emissions since 1000 AD worldwide, and it's an exponential curve. We now have 0.0424% carbon dioxide in the air we breathe. It used to be 0.028. And of course, what that means is that with more carbon dioxide and methane and other greenhouse gases going into our atmosphere, it acts like a blanket below the ozone layer, which traps heat in when the sun shines. It doesn't get released as easily. And that, of course, is what is getting or making this planet hotter and hotter. And so that chart goes up to the Paris Agreement, where internationally we agreed that we would limit rises in global temperature to 2 degrees with an ambition to make sure that it's no more than 1.5 degrees in global warming. And we have already reached the 1.5 degrees of global warming this year. So in February this year, we had 12 months where that was the case. So what that tells me is that if we have plans to make sure that we comply with the Paris Agreement and comply with the 1.5 degree target, that very simply means that we need to end coal and oil and gas. Not in 2050, not net zero by some distant date, but really ending the harm now. That's just the only realistic view, I would put it to you, of how to comply with this goal to make sure that our planet is livable. So now that the legal background, and there's 4 areas that we're going to go through. First of all, the oil and gas industry. Second, electricity. Third, roads. And fourth, bus and rail regulation. So let's start with the really big one, gas and oil and coal. The structure in the UK is that all of the companies operating in gas and oil and coal have to be licensed to do anything. If you want to drill, if you want to set up an oil rig, you've got to get a license from the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State delegates the license granting authority to something called the North Sea Transition Authority. That used to be called the Oil and Gas Authority, or it's the Coal Authority. So everything is ultimately under state control because those licenses can be withdrawn if conditions are not complied with. In the Climate Change Act of 2008, there's a duty on government to make sure that we cut our greenhouse gas emissions by 100% by 2050. And through the Act, there's a system of 5-year budgets which are designed to gradually reduce down to zero the amount of carbon that we've got. So for instance, the 4th carbon budget is what we're operating in now. That's going from 2023 to 2027. And it says that we can have a maximum of 1,950 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's carbon dioxide and then methane and other greenhouse gases that have an equivalent effect of carbon dioxide. 1,950 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent as a maximum over that 5-year carbon budget. But in fact, from last year, we are already down at 384 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And so these carbon budgets are set 12 years in advance, but we're already ahead of that. And so one thing that we might think about is changing our ambition to get much faster down to zero. This 2050 date is set very far in the future, and it's worth noting that the German Constitutional Court said that the German government's plans weren't going fast enough. It was putting too much of a burden on younger generations to change more rapidly later on, and the government had to be more proactive now. And so you could probably tell a similar story about what's been happening in the UK. It's just sort of save it for later. And if you look at the fifth carbon budget, it's projecting that there should be a maximum of 1,725 megatons of carbon equivalent. The sixth carbon budget, much more rapid drop, down to 965. And so you've really got to question, well, why isn't it going faster already? Now, that's the Climate Change Act. So far, so good. But what does the other legislation, particularly about oil and gas, say? Well, it says something quite contradictory. The Petroleum Act 1998, Section 9A, which was actually introduced in 2015, says that the principal objective of the Oil and Gas Authority, now North Sea Transition Authority, the principal objective is to maximize the economic recovery of petroleum. So the Climate Change Act says, in a nutshell, net zero by 2050. The Petroleum Act says drill, baby, drill. And then we've got a sort of reserve power of the Secretary of State to give the North Sea Transition Authority directions, if necessary, in the interests of national security or the public interest, if there are exceptional circumstances. But otherwise, there's not much direct control over the industry through this legislation. Now, the bigger picture, of course, outside of the licensing, is that gas and oil and coal companies have until now evaded and externalized the costs of liability for and the costs of pollution and climate damage. But right around the world, there is a big upswing in what we call climate litigation. Litigation that is directed at stemming the climate crisis. And we don't have any case law in the UK, but 3 cases internationally are pretty instructive about what the likely trend is going to be, especially as the emergency grows more dire, more hurricanes, more floods, more bushfires all over the globe. The first case that's worth highlighting is called Liua, an RWE in 2015 in Germany. This is about Mr. Liua, pictured there on the top right, who lives next to a glacier in Peru. And he sues a German power company, RWE, because the glacier melts and his village is being flooded, and he wants to build flood defenses. And he points to the data that shows that RWE is responsible for 0.47% of all historic greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, if you add it up, there's just 90 companies that are responsible for about 60% of all greenhouse gas emissions historically. RWE is one of them. And he says, well, if you're responsible for 0.47% of greenhouse gas emissions globally and historically, then you should pay 0.47% of my flood defense costs for building defenses against the melting glacier. And what's happened with this case, incredibly slowly, is that the upper state court, unlike the lower courts which reject that there should be any causation between RWE and a right for Mr. Liua to claim, the upper state court says, we think that there's something in it, and we're going to investigate whether there's good enough evidence to establish liability. And long story short, they're probably going to do a judgment next year. There's a guy at UCL, an LSE, in fact, in the Grantham Institute called Noel, who's been part of this case, and it's really interesting. Second case. Oh, and I suppose to just add, if that case worked, I mean, the logical implication is that other companies like Exxon or BP or Shell that are responsible for 1, 2, whatever it is percentage, would logically also be liable to Mr. Liua to pay for flood defenses, and everyone else on the planet would be as well. And of course, the consequence of that would be that all oil, gas, and coal companies will be insolvent, and so you would have a very, very big set of political consequences that will follow from a ruling like that in Germany. Next case is called Smith and Fonterra, and this is in New Zealand, which of course, unlike Germany, is a common law country, and this involves Mr. Smith, who has Maori background there in the picture, who claims against the subsidiaries of Exxon, BP, JP Morgan, and Vesco that their activities in the power industry in New Zealand have caused damage to his coastal property, for instance, from rising sea levels, and they should be liable in either negligence, private or public nuisance for that damage. The lower courts reject it, but the Supreme Court of New Zealand says, yes, the case can go to trial. It doesn't strike out the action. It rejects that the damage is not foreseeable, which of course is one of the main tests in tort liability. It rejects that there's a lack of proximity or that the contribution to damage by these companies is too small to be worth suing over. And so you can imagine exactly the same kind of reasoning under English common law if you get a court that is sufficiently receptive and aware of the scale of the problem just by applying ordinary tort law principles. And the same implications could flow. Of course, these cases will take a long time to work through, but it is important. Third case, and directly relevant to something that's happened in the UK, is called Milieu Defense, which is also the Friends of the Earth arm in the Netherlands, and Royal Dutch Shell PLC. And here, the NGO, Milieu Defense, alleged that under the Dutch Civil Code, Shell had failed to follow the Paris Agreement, and this sounded in tort liability, interpreted in light of the European Convention on Human Rights and the right to life. The Hague District Court holds that yes, indeed, Shell is liable in tort if it fails to comply with its UN and Paris obligations, which amount, it says, to cutting its emissions by 45% by 2030, like nation states have to do. The company itself has an equivalent duty in private law, just as the state has in public law to cut its emissions. So it granted an injunction, not damages, but you've got to do the thing. And Shell said, oh, well, of course we'll comply. But then what it also did is it dropped the name, it dropped the Royal and the Dutch from its name, and it relocated its headquarters from Amsterdam to London. It says, we're not doing this because of the case, not at all. We just want to do this anyway. But that was its response, perhaps to escape later jurisdictional control. Now, there's another piece of the UK legal framework that is useful for us. And this is very under-discussed, and that's why we're going to discuss it now. The Secretary of State with any company can petition a court if it appears to be expedient in the public interest that the company should be wound up. So usually companies go into liquidation or administration because they're insolvent, but it's also possible to have an application for a company to be wound up in the public interest if the court is persuaded that it's just and equitable. This is long-standing law under the Insolvency Act 1986. And there's a number of ways that you can get to this. The first and the most interesting is that it can follow a report from a company investigation. And there's two main ways for our purposes that we can get an investigation into a company. One is if you get 200 members of a company, usually shareholders, to call on the Secretary of State to launch an investigation if they give £5,000 in security and the Secretary of State approves. Second way that we can get a company investigation is if the Secretary of State decides to do it based on its assessment that the company's affairs are being conducted, number of reasons, but key one for our purposes, for a fraudulent or unlawful purpose. And that last bit, an unlawful purpose, is quite wide. Or if the managers of the company are guilty of fraud, misconduct towards members, and a bunch of other things under the Companies Act 1985. We can also put start a winding up procedure in the public interest under the Financial Services and Markets Act provisions for money laundering, terrorist financing, if there's fraud under the Criminal Justice Act, or to help overseas regulators. But the point that I want to draw your attention to is that this procedure has not yet been used for fraud or this broad idea of an unlawful purpose of a company in relation to climate damage. So if you've got a company that has a purpose and it is being run with the purpose of unlawfully violating the Paris Agreement or domestic law relating to climate change, that could potentially be good grounds for an investigation and the beginning of a winding up procedure. Now, how could this possibly apply to BP, Shell, and other companies like it? Well, there's a number of reasons why it might apply. We have a lot of at least anecdotal evidence that companies like BP and Shell are deliberately engaging in deception about their climate ambitions, greenwashing. They pretend to engage with shareholders about decarbonisation, but then the whistleblower pictured here in 2022, Caroline Dennett, says that it's all being done with the intention of all the engagement is just fake. It's not really happening. And companies are increasingly backtracking on the goals that they state. There is a simple refusal to comply with the Paris Agreement, certainly nothing like, in the case of Shell, reduction of emissions of 45% by 2030. Okay, so that's the background on oil and gas. What about electricity generation and transmission and distribution? So you've got three parts to the electricity energy. How it's generated, for instance, wind turbines, transmission through the grid, and then retail, the companies that you buy electricity from, that's the distribution part. Starting point is that Ofgem, the regulator, is appointed by the Secretary of State and licenses all generators. You don't need a license if you're a small generator, but actually small generators can be quite big, so up to 50 megawatts with a stated net capacity of under 100 megawatts. We've got something called the Low Carbon Contracts Company, which has played a major role in building or encouraging the building of all our offshore wind energy. So what the LCCC does is it makes contracts for difference to give builders of wind turbines a price into the future which is calculated to be slightly above market, expected market rates to encourage investment. So it's essentially public spending on the wind turbine industry, or has been used especially for that. Ofgem has a duty in relation to electricity to reduce emissions of targeted greenhouse gases. Ofgem is also in control of gas, but there's a much lower duty. It only has a duty to ensure that the gas industry, mainly your central heating, complies with the net zero target in the Climate Change Act and the 5-year carbon budgets. Then we've got the grid. And the grid is privately owned by the National Grid PLC company, which is slightly odd because, of course, that's a natural monopoly. And so you wouldn't normally think that that was a candidate for private ownership rather than public ownership, but it is regulated. Prices are controlled by Ofgem, and it's got a duty to connect generators and distribution companies to the grid. We're also setting up an independent systems operator, which is designed to hold the assets from new investment in the grid as we decarbonise. And then the third part at the distribution end is what you're familiar with from your electricity bills. If you've got sort of British Gas or SSE or Scottish Power providing your power. These are shareholder controlled companies by and large, or Octopus, and there's basically 6 big ones. Just to show you what a 50 megawatt solar farm looks like. This is one in Branston in Lincolnshire. So you don't need a license for something of this size. That's roughly 1 kilometre squared, 94 hectares, and it's enough to power 15,000 homes. So, a lot of farmland in the UK is ripe for installation of solar panels. If you had 1,500 of these over the UK, then you would have enough power that, for what the Climate Change Committee says we need from solar to get to our net zero target. And the good news is that you can also have sheep underneath the solar panels. They just wander on along and eat the grass in the normal way. Okay, third part of the regulatory background is on roads. So the road regulation that we've got starts with really foreign law relating to the big car manufacturers in the UK. So we got Nissan, Jaguar Land Rover, which is owned by Tata, the Indian company, BMW from Germany, Toyota, and Stellantis, which is based in the Netherlands. And Indian, Japanese law, German law, and Dutch law control the way that these companies run, because, of course, we don't have any domestically owned big car manufacturers, or hardly any anymore in the UK. They're mainly controlled by shareholders in the case of India and Japan, or entirely. German law is slightly different. You have workers on the board representing about just under half of the supervisory board. And in Holland, you're meant to, but Stellantis seems to have gotten out of too much worker representation. The Secretary of State doesn't control these companies directly. It doesn't have any powers to direct what car manufacturers do. It does, however, have quite a bit of control over the charging points that electric cars will need to recharge with around the country, because since the 2018 Automated and Electric Vehicles Act, the Secretary of State can direct basically petrol stations and big car parks to install electric vehicle chargers, either itself on its own motion or at the request of the mayor. And this just hasn't really happened yet. So really it's been left to the market so far to have electric charging points installed. The Capital Allowances Act and a bunch of other tax legislation enables businesses, when they get new vehicles, to write off the costs from their taxes, or get tax deductions when they get new vehicles. But these tax deductions are available for any kind of vehicle, not just electric and clean energy vehicles. And then you've got taxis, lots of taxis all around. They're a big source of emissions. They all need to be licensed, but there's no duties yet in relation to clean energy vehicles. Fourth part is bus and rail regulation. We have a regulator called the Office of Rail and Road. It's got a duty of sustainable development, but not much direct control over manufacturing. We've got bus networks having to be licensed by the transport, or the relevant transport authority. It's different in London. In London, we've got much more power over our bus companies. We can set up a public bus company. We can control timetables and fares. That isn't the case yet in the rest of the UK, with one or two exceptions. Bus networks cannot, in fact, be publicly owned around the UK, subject to some exceptions, mainly with elected mayors, Manchester notably. Train operating companies are banned, like buses, from being in public ownership by the UK. Instead, every other country in the world seems to own our trains, like the Netherlands, France, Germany, but not the British government. And that's the effect, or has been the effect since 1993 under Section 25 of the Railways Act. So most of our train operating companies are privately owned or owned by other governments, not ours. And then you've got Network Rail, which owns the track. That's a public company. And that came after the former privately owned firm, Railtrack, was responsible for a number of horrible train crashes and went insolvent, got taken into administration, and is now publicly owned. Okay, so that's the legal background. How do we rank internationally? Same categories. First of all, and like you saw last week if you were here, the UK's emissions seem to be falling. It seems to be pretty good news. And just two to highlight for the purpose of our lecture. So you've got transport, buildings, industry, electricity supply, agriculture, and so on. If you look at transport, basically emissions haven't really gone anywhere since 1990. It's pretty much flat. We've got a few electric vehicles coming along. Of course, COVID accounts for the dip at the end. But transport is pretty stubborn in getting emissions down. Electricity supply, on the other hand, big success story, because we really shut down all our coal plants. But doing more to get right down to zero is going to be a tough ask, mainly because a lot of the former coal plants have started burning wood pellets instead of coal. So that still accounts for a lot of emissions. And then, of course, we've got gas-fired power stations. When you look at the overall picture, it seems good. We're down from over 800 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 1990 to 384 last year. But these are territorial emissions, and they exclude three main things. They exclude the operations of our companies abroad listed in the FTSE 100. It excludes the financing that the City of London does for fossil fuels abroad, and it also excludes the imports that we have into the UK. So if you've got carbon burnt abroad, that embedded carbon is not taken into account in our territorial emission statistics. Just for comparison, this is America. So America overall is roughly the same place as it was in 1990. So even with the Biden administration and the fabled Inflation Reduction Act, it hasn't actually moved things that much. As a percentage of global emissions, as I mentioned at the start, the US is actually not that much anymore. It's 11.2%. The big one is China, 30%. It's got its peak emissions this year. India is still going up, but it has a chance to leapfrog fossil fuels and get to cheaper, clean energy. The EU is coming down in the same way as the UK. And if you add up these 4 jurisdictions or groups of jurisdictions, you get to more than half global carbon greenhouse gas emissions. So that's why what the UK does is very important, because we can set a positive role model. If we want to do that, we've got to look bigger than our territorial emissions. As we said last week, when you look at BP, Shell and Glencore, the 3 big fossil fuel companies in the FTSE 100, and you add up their global emissions, it comes to 13 times the UK's total greenhouse gas emissions. So the UK's territorial emissions are 384 megatons of carbon equivalent, depicted there in this chart. But BP, Shell and Glencore come to 13 times that. And because we control these companies, they're domiciled here, it sort of seems like we should be worried about what's happening with them, as well as just decarbonising domestic electricity and transport. Now, you might think, well, these problems are too huge to solve. How can we possibly tackle multinational companies like BP and Shell? But there is a good model to do this, and it's called Ørsted in Denmark. Because Ørsted used to be a company that had, called Dong Energy at the time, state-owned. It used to be 85% coal and oil and gas. 85% of its business was toxic fossil fuels. And in 2009, it started a plan to transform this, flip it on its head, to become, it wanted to be 85% renewable energy by this distant target date of 2040. In 2014, it started selling off some of its shares. It sold a minority stake. It's now 50.1% Danish government owned. It changed, and this was to raise capital investment to boost an offshore wind industry. It changed its name to Ørsted. It sold some of its oil and gas to Ineos, a British company. And by 2019, 21 years ahead of when it planned, because of just the fundamental economics of renewable energy, it had already got to 86% renewables, and of course now it is the world's largest offshore wind producer. So it is possible. When we look at electricity generation, where we rank, and remember, this is a fraction of UK domestic emissions, and this pales in comparison to the oil and gas industry globally that we control. But electricity generation in this chart shows where the UK is in how far we've come to renewables. And what it shows, so it's percentage of renewable generation on the x-axis down the bottom, how much we pay for our energy on the y-axis per kilowatt hour measured in dollars, and the dots, so the colours of the dots, tell us whether we've got a country with a majority publicly owned electricity industry, in yellow if it's mixed between public and private, or in red if it's mostly privatised. Of course, in the UK, we are mostly privatised. And what the chart shows, these are OECD countries plus China, India, is that when you have more renewable energy, costs seem to go down. So renewable energy is in fact cheaper, and this has been borne out by the experiences of most countries. And countries that are doing better seem to have more green dots, so more publicly owned. if we want a Clean Air Act, we might as well ask where air pollution comes from. And this just breaks down the statistics of where most air problems begin. And I don't need to go through all of this, but in a nutshell, if we tackle transport and if we tackle energy generation, we're taking very, very big chunks out of problems with toxic air. So energy generation is crucial. Transport is also crucial. And this is the picture of how we're doing with the electrification of our roads. So the UK produced domestically just over 1 million vehicles in 2023. Most of those are exported, and then we import lots. We don't produce enough for the amount of vehicles that we buy. So we buy, or we registered last year, 2.5 million vehicles. We've got about 40 million vehicles on our roads. And if you just sort of do the maths, that would mean about 16 years of sort of natural changeover before all of the vehicle fleet becomes electric. And we are on just about, or just under, or just above 20% battery electric vehicles being sold in new registrations. This is a chart from Carbon Tracker, and on the in the light blue dots at the bottom, you've got battery electric vehicles going up, and what they're depicting is what we call an S-curve, and this is a sort of logical pattern of the way that markets work, and if you have a good new technology displacing an old obsolete technology. It'll start off gradually, it'll go up rapidly, and then it'll taper off at the top. And of course, you've got the same thing for fossil fuel vehicles going down in the other direction. So that's the sort of economics, but what I want to impress upon everyone from a law perspective is that if you reach a point where the economics just make sense for having electric vehicles instead of fossil fuel vehicles, and you regulate to require that fossil fuel vehicles are not sold anymore, you can turn the S-curve into a J-curve. So instead of going up and then tapering off, you go up and then just bam, all new vehicles have to be electric if that's your policy. The UK is not doing terribly well with electric charging points. Sure, we've got loads in London, but London is actually, ironically, the place where you least need electric charging because you've got the best public transport infrastructure. So a third of electric charging points are in London, but more of the population is outside of London. This is where we are on bus journeys around the UK. London, of course, very high number of bus journeys. Other areas decline, and that's largely because no public bus networks being privatized, very high costs. And so that's something that needs to be looked at to turn it around. And finally, these are the statistics on electrification and railway fares. So on the x-axis, you see the percentage at which a railway industry is electrified. Again, this is OECD plus India. I don't think I've got China on here, but it's OECD countries plus India. And the fares that you pay for railways. And again, if it's green, it's public. If it's yellow, it's mixed. And if it's red, it's mostly privatized. And basically what you see is that if you've got more money going into the railway service, it's more likely to be electrified. That's the sort of trend line. But countries can do very well, keep low fares. It seems that they do a bit better if they're public. The UK is not doing terribly well at all. Very high costs, low electrification levels under 40%. Okay, so now the last part is the models that we've got to reform. First of all, if we have a duty to phase out, not maximize oil, we could start by changing, and if we want to have an Energy Independence Act, we could start by changing the Petroleum Act 1998, Section 9A. It wasn't there before 2015, and very simply there could be a duty on the regulators to cease oil and gas instead of maximizing production consistent with energy security and independence. Yeah?
I have a quick question on
this. Of course.
Wouldn't that be the same as that Peru case that you mentioned earlier? It's effectively the same, right? Because if that case gets, passed
effect
in
would
some
be.
manner, it would be like insolvency, basically. I'm sorry, I'm using new words here.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, you can come at the problem with different directions, can't you?
Right.
So one way would be tackling with tort liability. Another way would be, what the duties of the regulators are.
And so everybody's trying to do it in multiple ways.
Yeah, I mean, this is really this section of what I'm talking about is all about the options that are available, and so you're absolutely right. Like any one of these things could drive the oil and gas industry very quickly into cessation. We often talk about, by the way, just transition. I've got a great colleague in Australia called Frances, and she's written a brilliant paper called The Just Cessation of Fossil Fuels. This idea that we've got time for a transition is falling out of popularity. So next thing, next option that we've got is that we could trigger company investigations. If you've got 200 shareholders in BP or Shell, hands up if you're a shareholder of BP or Shell. No, nobody. Oh, okay. Well, so there's one out of our 200. Yeah. Client Earth, of course, got a shareholder in Shell and brought a derivative action, didn't succeed. But if you get 200 people, you can ask the Secretary of State for an investigation. Or you could just ask Ed Miliband to start an investigation, or perhaps Jonathan Reynolds to start an investigation of their own accord into whether they are actually violating the Paris Agreement, and that could be the preparatory work for winding up in the public interest and turning companies like BP and Shell worldwide into a business like Ørsted. And of course, remember, this is what was planned for BP almost 2 decades ago. Remember the slogan of Beyond Petroleum. And it just didn't, you had a change of the board of directors and it just didn't happen because the fundamentals of making profit militated against it. So that points you in the direction of needing the state to be proactive. Second set of options.
Could I just ask
of course.
That last point? Isn't Paris Agreement binding on companies in the private sector directly?
No, not as a matter of international law as we know, because the Paris Agreement has, it's signed by countries, and so for everybody who's not in international law, of course, those are obligations between nation states. However, it is entirely open to any country's judiciary to say that there is an indirect effect of international obligations. So what you see in the Royal Dutch Shell case in Milieu de France, where the Dutch Hague Court says Shell has an obligation to cut its emissions by 45%, is the interpretation of the civil code in light of international obligations. Although that might not be a concept that many English lawyers are inherently comfortable with, some are very comfortable with it, others might disagree, that is something that seems to be a logical consequence of where the European Court of Human Rights is going. Because if there's positive obligations on the state, that implies that the state needs to change the way its private law systems work in order to get to the same result. Okay, so for energy generation and distribution, we've got a great British energy bill. It says in section 232 that the object of GB Energy will be to participate in production, distribution and storage of supply of clean energy. There's been a debate about whether GB Energy should just facilitate private investment or it should actually own generation and infrastructure. The bill suggests very much that it can own assets and it can be financed by the Secretary of State. It's also entirely open in the bill for GB Energy to set up retail companies to compete with the big six, so that you have a public option energy distributor that you can switch to from British Gas or whatever else you've got at the moment. You could have duties on Ofgem and suppliers of clean generation and storage within any time range that you wanted, but 4 years might be a good period of time since there's a 5-year parliament for the current government. And all of this could be part of a Clean Air Act, because if you want clean air, logically you've got to tackle energy generation, and transport as we'll come to. You could include in your Clean Energy Act a duty on on the grid to connect all clean energy generators in a quick period of time. Currently, the biggest problem with clean energy projects, solar, wind, is that they just take forever for the grid to connect. And so you just mandate that National Grid PLC, private company, has to connect, and if it doesn't do it, then there could be a series of sanctions or reforms to its governance that follow. Because other countries that have got publicly owned energy do it, new forms of public governance generally include workers and service users in electing the directors on the board. We see this in Denmark with publicly owned companies, and we see it in Germany. Good example is Nordrhein-Westfalen, 1/3 directors on the board, and you've got to have representation in the energy company for the councillors, such as the mayor. Final section is options for road, bus and rail reform. First of all, easy thing to do, very cost effective. If the Chancellor's worried about black holes in the budget, stop the tax deductions for fossil fuel vehicles, and you'll save money for companies because fossil fuel cars, fossil fuel vans cost more over 5 years, 10 years than electric vehicles. And that's simply because electricity is cheaper over the long period, even if there's higher upfront costs. Of course, as we reach cost parity between electric and fossil fuel vehicles, the economics just does not make sense anymore to subsidize through the state any more fossil fuel vehicles. As part of the Clean Air Act, you could require the big automakers in the UK to go electric, say in 4 years, and you could ensure that there is public money put into this by the big fleets that are publicly owned, the NHS, the police, the Royal Mail, having a duty to buy all electric vehicles from UK manufacturers. That would be a Brexit dividend. You could require that all petrol stations have electric charging points, trigger the existing legislation. We haven't done it yet. Why not? Who knows? That's an easy one to do. Make sure that there is every petrol station has an electric charging point. And you could bring forward the promised ban on the internal combustion engine. Why wait till 2030 to ban fossil fuel vehicles when they cause toxic pollution, they damage our children's lungs, and they will be, probably by next year or the year after, more expensive up front than an equivalent electric vehicle. We've got a Great British Railways bill, which is now taking train operating companies back into public ownership when their franchises expire. We've got a buses bill, not published yet, but coming soon, that'll let local authorities around the country start their own bus services like they do in London. What these bills don't have and don't yet promise is electrification. So the UK has about 32%, 38%, I think, of its railways electrified. Fun fact, India had roughly the same level of electrification 12 years ago. It set up something called the Indian Railways Electrification Commission, and it got up to 96%. That's the whole of India in 12 years electrifying all its tracks. So our previous transport, what was his name? Chris Grayling, he just said it wasn't possible and electrification projects were axed, but it certainly is possible. India's done it for its railways. China has done it for its buses. This is when the train companies will come back into public ownership. So by summer of next year, roughly 3/4 of our trains will be back in public ownership because all the franchises will expire. Okay, so now on to discussion, and these are the main questions. What should be done, if anything, with BP, Shell and Glencore as part of this promise for international action? How can decarbonisation of electricity go as quick as possible, even quicker than 2030? How can road traffic be electrified as fast as possible? And how can rail be electrified in the same way? So now I'd like to invite Matt Lawrence up onto the stage. As I say, from Commonwealth Think Tank, which he has founded and is a director, done stellar work all the time. And so, warm round of applause for Matt. Yeah, just have a seat. And we've got a microphone and yeah, as we said, just make some remarks and then we can open discussion.
Sure. agenda is a wider transport agenda in its kind of political context, which is kind of a triple crisis which they inherited, which is not unique to the UK. It's kind of sort of a generalised condition for most advanced economies of the last few years, which is this combination of economic stagnation, sort of geopolitical competition, and then a crisis of political legitimacy in various forms, whether that was the Brexit shock, sort of Trump in 2016, which in some ways sat behind Bidenomics. Of course, now we've got Trump in 2024, so we'll see what economic and climate responses that brings from the Democrats. The thing is, that's a triple fusion of economic stagnation, political sort of legitimacy crisis, and then mounting geopolitical competition that sits behind the turn to decarbonisation, both as a sort of moral imperative, as a sort of collective project of world makers to transform our civilizations from fossil fuels to a sort of post-carbon future, but I think also a growth strategy and a political strategy. And I think what you saw quite interesting from Labour, both in the election, but I think also as Ewan's taken us through in its kind of programmatic outline of how we'll decarbonise, is climate and decarbonisation has shifted from this like, oh, this is this peripheral thing that, oh, this is the main part of our agenda, and then we do this over here, and that's a nice thing to have, and we say that so Greenpeace doesn't give us a hard time, to actually kind of fundamental to their growth agenda, their vision of society, and then the political coalitions they try and bring around, because their solution to the cost of living crisis is let's cut bills through decarbonising electricity and more public transport. Jobs and growth, it's let's invest, let's scale. So I think that's quite interesting. I think worth sort of setting the context, kind of the legal architectures, the political architecture flows from those kind of deeper currents and political conjunctures that Labour's agendas emerge from. The second thing, I think then you can sort of, so I think, bucket Labour's agenda in kind of three areas, which I'll sort of unpack in terms of how they're planning to decarbonise. And I think sort of, sort of legal interventions and kind of transforming both production and consumption through sort of rewiring sort of the legal architecture is obviously one part of that, and sort of overlays all three of them. But I think broadly it's a change in Britain's macroeconomic framework and fiscal position and fiscal sort of approach to investment, reform of the planning system, and then green industrial strategy, and I'll sort of unpack those briefly. So I think some of you may have seen the budget the other day, and I think there was a shift in the debt rule that the Treasury uses, and that was important because it sort of pushed back against an anti-investment bias that had been baked into the UK's macroeconomic framework, and that has enabled the Chancellor to announce extra investment, which over the course of the Parliament will amount to around £100 billion of extra investment over the next 5 years, relative to the baseline she inherited, which admittedly was a terrible baseline, one of the worst of all advanced economies in terms of the share of public investment in the economy. But I think importantly, of that 100 extra billion, much of it is dedicated to specific interventions that will seek to accelerate decarbonisation and to capture the benefits of the public more effectively, whether that's in ports, in renewables, in industrial clusters, in kind of decarbonising housing and heating. This is a sort of clear shift towards an investment-led effort to decarbonise, which I think is one interesting thing to note. The second thing, which I think is both important but overplayed by Labour, is the role the planning system plays currently to inhibit development of clean energy infrastructure and decarbonising infrastructure in the round, and sort of the legal infrastructural planning is, I think, very important in shaping how we approach decarbonisation. But I think a lot of their sort of economic, political, ecological strategy really rests on this idea that by removing barriers, by deregulating the planning system, by weakening veto points within the system, that will unlock, they often hear some like metaphors about unlocking or unleashing or releasing like waves of private investment that's kind of just here, and if you just remove this sort of legal barrier, sort of cultural barrier, that will flow through. I think they really are leaning on that quite heavily, and I think you can see that, for example, when they, and some of this is very sensible, when they unwound or overturned the ban on onshore wind, that was an early down payment, onshore wind farms, that is. That was an early down payment. So I think the second plank is planning reform, but I think, and this relates to the third part, I think part of the problem with the planning reform emphasis is that is definitely a mezzanine barrier, but ultimately, investment is undertaken based on profitability, based on sort of future expectations of return. And while the planning system can be a barrier and can increase costs, it is in and of itself the fundamental barrier to why we haven't decarbonised the economy and the kind of best interests that kind of nestle around cost of capital. So I think planning is the sort of second one. And the third, which gets focused more sort of concretely, is green industrial strategy, which I think you've seen a nascent turn, frankly in many ways begun by Trump rather than Biden, although Biden got much of the sort of political association with it, and much of it driven by sort of highly sort of great power competition logics. And so obviously China's coordinated market economy has done incredibly well in sort of carving out massive leads in clean energy technologies through a very sophisticated industrial sort of institutional architecture. So for not just sort of wasteful subsidies as it's sometimes portrayed, but I think within the sort of balance of geopolitical power that clearly led to sort of squeeze back from Trump and then continued by Biden of an effort to mobilise the American state to drive a renaissance of US manufacturing and green tech, which is kind of, I think, will be a through line through to Trump in a way, alongside massive expansion of oil and gas. Well, they are the largest producer, but continued expansion of oil and gas in the US and US corporates. But essentially, what is industrial strategy? It is a recognition that there are severe systemic limits to relying on market coordination to deliver rapid, fair, and sort of affordable decarbonisation of the economy as a whole, but also through specific strategic sectors. What is market coordination? Well, it's sort of institutional architecture that essentially relies on a combination of market governance and competition, for-profit driven investment logics, and then private, often very concentrated and financialised ownership forms to somehow magic up the fixed capital investment needed to shift from a world in which most infrastructures of production, consumption, energy generation, and so on and so forth rely on fossil fuels, out of that fixed capital investment, trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of capital, into new production lines, new ways of organising our society. And markets are very effective in many ways, but market coordination is ill-suited to do that in a number of sectors that we need to do at pace and scale to undertake the type of thing that you have spoken about. And so industrial strategy is an effort to govern investment cycles beyond the limits of market coordination. And there's been this nascent turn to public coordination through a set of institutional commitments, policy commitments by Labour. Some of those have been mentioned, I think, just worth touching on them. So the National Wealth Fund, this idea that is partly sort of capitalised from the budget, the idea of actively investing to sort of shape and scale green sort of sectors and technologies rather than just let the market kind of try and sort of find it. So we'll see how that goes. It's kind of both an important but kind of smallish institutional intervention. Things like planning, so the 2030 clean power target, which is very ambitious. I think it really is, if they hit that, it will be a genuinely transformative industrial transition of the energy sector, or the power sector rather. So sort of tools of planning, of coordination, of saying like this is when we're going to get there and we're going to work back from there to get there. And then I think we'll probably all end on this because I didn't have that one, but I think sort of new forms of public ownership, which can be based on new forms of investment logics that can divorce investment from, for example, the profit imperative and short-termism, and instead focus investment on long-term social goals, such as decarbonising energy. And there I think you can think of GB Energy as an interesting example of the return of a sort of partial but real form of public ownership to the political stage. So GB Energy is Labour's commitment to create a publicly owned energy company, capitalised with an initial sort of sum of around 8.3 billion, but let's see if that goes up or down or if it has borrowing powers. But the essential argument there in relation to decarbonisation, which again, if you think about it like how do we mobilise and direct investment, fixed investment into the real world, to the real assets, not just financial investment in allocating money to financial portfolios. But how do we govern fixed capital investment to decarbonise both existing fossil fuel-led forms of living and build out post-carbon ways of living? So I think GB Energy and public ownership in general isn't necessarily perfect in and of itself, but what it is, it allows you institutional flexibility to pursue a range of goals, a range of outcomes rather than just profit maximisation. And in particular, it sort of yields three sort of singular benefits in terms of cost, coherence, and certainty. So, decarbonisation in the energy sector in particular, but really across most sort of spheres, is a very capital-intensive sort of project. To take a wind farm, most of the input, the wind, is free, so the big cost is upfront to build the thing, and the build of that thing is typically through debt. It's through debt financing. And the cost of debt for the state, through GD Energy, is structurally and significantly lower than the equivalent private sector actors. And if you sort of scale that up over time, that wedge, that difference, is very significant, and that cost doesn't disappear. It ultimately comes down to us, as households, consumers, through energy bills. And so there's a lower cost through public investment, public undertaking to decarbonise. Second, it's structurally more coherent. So again, if you have, like we have in the UK, a privatised, highly fragmented energy system in which you have multiple actors trying to coordinate investment through isolation, through competition, and then some sort of weird hybrid regulatory overlay, which is where Ofgem, that you mentioned, comes in. It's not a very coherent system. It's not a very coherent system in terms of how investment is organised, at what timelines, how it's sequenced, and therefore is it kind of temporally, spatially, and in terms of the price system, coherent in a way that yields both decarbonisation, but yields it on the terms that is politically sellable, is politically tractable. And so, if you have a publicly owned sort of energy generation, you can have that coherence because you can plan at a sort of system level rather than project level view, which is where obviously most private companies take a decision on, we will build this wind farm if it makes certain amounts of profit. And if it doesn't, we won't. Whereas if you're a publicly owned thing, you say, well, we need to do this because that was what the system needs, so we're going to do it. So to take gas, your gas point, this, you said that Labour want gas, spare gas in the system as part of their goal, which is the reality of the energy system. Again, you ask yourself, well, do we, the public, want to have a sort of, give us this position of leverage to a private company to have gas on standby deep into the 2030s, in which they will be acutely able to extract rent from society by saying, well, okay, we'll keep this on, you've got to pay us a massive, massive premium because we're not using this asset most of the time? Or do you say, actually, we might more functionally sort of coherent to say, well, we'll actually sit on the state's balance sheet and we will turn it on and off as we need, but this is not a sort of vehicle for extracting rent, it's a coherent part of a planned energy transition. And then the final thing that sort of something like GD Energy gets you, and indeed industrial strategy as a whole, is certainty. And so should we, as a society, as a planet, be undertaking the transition and organising investment based on whether the energy system will generate certain rates of return, clear certain hurdle rates for private companies, or should we be investing based on the existential certainty that if we fail to electrify society based on decarbonisation and clean power, then all the horrors that are already forming in the world through climate change, but will intensify, will happen. And it would seem to me that it's much more sensible to organise investment in such fundamental infrastructures as the energy system, not on the uncertain nature of is this going to be profitable, particularly in renewables. You might have seen the book by Brett Christophers that caused a bit of a stir earlier in the year, but not based on are renewables profitable, and they aren't that profitable, that's part of the problem, and that's why you need things like contracts for differences to backstop profitability. Are we going to organise investment based on is this profitable for a randomised selection of competing private firms, or are we going to organise investment based on what the planet, what the public, and what the population need? And so I think Labour's agenda, particularly on climate and energy, is actually in some ways some of the most ambitious parts of their agenda. I think there's lots of areas where you can improve it, go further. But I think those sort of three interlocking pieces of macroeconomic reform to unlock investment, planning reform to kind of stimulate investment from the private sector in particular, and then industrial strategy which leans on tools of coordination, public ownership, public direct investment, and then unlocks those benefits of cost, coherence, and certainty, is an incremental but real step forwards, and I think the challenge is to accelerate those to deliver this type of benefits, decarbonisation and yield.
Great, thank you. Questions or comments?